But what about the peasants? There's a great quote from the French social historian called Georges Duby. In the medieval world, the countryside was everything, and I really think that is true. The peasants represented perhaps 85% of the medieval European population. Within the heading of peasant, though, there was a lot of variability. The legal status of peasants has always aroused passions among historians, particularly around whether they were free or not and what their obligations were. So nowadays we can all pretty much agree that the peasants existed in a world that was dominated by masters. We worry less about identifying their legal status, which we know was very variable. Peasants and what a peasant's life was varied. Instead, we tend to look at their social position. Peasant also implies agriculturally based. But we need to remember that there was a small amount, you know, anywhere maybe 10% of the high medieval population that was a town dweller, and they certainly do not fit very easily in this pyramid of medieval life. These are the burgesses on the earlier slide. Here they are as burghers. Two different ways it could be known, depending on what country, or an artisan or a merchant. They were not engaged primarily in agriculture, and they were not resident in rural areas. Now, slavery, there were not many slaves in Western Europe by the High Middle Ages. In Western Europe, rapidly decreasing numbers until they were practically non-existent in the High Middle Ages, and that is because Christianity forbade Christian slaves. So the last time we have widespread slavery was during the Viking Age, because the Vikings had not yet converted to Christianity. Now, out in the Byzantine Empire, there were a lot of slaves. And that's mainly because of the legacy that there are so many different religions and cultures existing side by side in the Byzantine Empire. That's why they still had a heavy reliance on slaves. Part of the reason why they didn't have very many slaves in Western Europe is because of the existence of the serf. The serfs were really at the lowest rung of the peasant ladder. Serfs were subject to very heavy deductions from the revenues of their labour. They were attached to their lords by a personal link. So they were bodily dependent on the lord. They belonged to the manor. They could be bought, sold, and pledged to the manor. And the manor is a term that's going to come up in a later video in this Nearpod. So it's very important, though, to distinguish that serf is definitely a long way above slave, though. I mean, they have pretty rotten lives for sure, but they were, you know, not laboring hard for no pay. They weren't forced into it in that way. It's definitely a layer above slavery. Definitely don't be like, a lot of students read a description as a serf and they're like, oh, so they're basically slaves. And no, they're not slaves. They get paid, not very much, but they get paid. We also need to remember at the other end of the peasant scale, there's the freeholders. And those, as the name free implies, they hold their land freely, which means that they don't depend on anybody except themselves. And their wealth could be very variable. They just don't have, they could be even, you know, as wealthy as knights, but they didn't have the title to go with it. There's also tenant farmers who would have paid one or several lords various rents. We call the one pertaining to the land quit rent, or to the right of command, we call that the ban. In Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, renting was pretty common, that you paid rent to a lord for your fields, and that's how he made his money, and then you paid taxes to the state depending on the soil quality. So there's a video now to watch from the Terry Jones series, only a few minutes long, which is going to give you a good idea in real terms how these different levels of peasants really existed.